Good afternoon. I'm Hugh Rupersberg, and I'm here to keep this conversation going. I'm the moderator, and I'm very pleased to be part of this authors discussion, which is sponsored by the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. I will tell you who the members of this panel are. There are excellent descriptions of them on this sheet of paper that you received when you came in, so rather than rehearse through this document, I'll just tell you to refer to it. Immediately to my left and the right from your point of view is David Bottoms from Georgia State University, Coleman Barks, who was a professor of English here at the University of Georgia, Terry Kay, well-known novelist, and Farrell Sams of Fayette County, also a well-known Georgia writer. So I'm very pleased to be able to be here with these people, and somebody suggested that we think of this as a front porch conversation, and I like that idea. I hope that I'll introduce some topics, and the panelists can respond to them, talk to each other, talk to members of the audience. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of this session. So first of all, I'd like to ask each of the members of the panel to just say a little bit about how they started out as writers. How did it occur to you that you wanted to be or could not help but be a writer? Start with David.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, golly, I could not help being a writer. When I was a kid, we didn't have any books in our house. We had baseball bats and baseball gloves. And my mom, though, encouraged me to read a lot. She didn't read. I didn't come from a reading family. And I just sort of fell in love with books. Why? I don't know. It's just very improbable that I would have done that. My grandmother was a reader and a dreamer. My mom's mom, as I like to say, she had about 10 novels on a little bookshelf in her living room. 2 of them were gone with the wind. She had a paperback and a hardback. And I'm sure that she was a great influence. When I started writing, I guess, when I was in high school, but you never show anybody anything you write in high school. It's just not very manly, but it wasn't then. And I sort of led a secret life as a writer until I got to college. And as I told you earlier, I was fortunate enough to meet the poet Jim C., a friend of ours. Mm-hmm. And Jim put me on to some other poets, and we became friends, and it sort of went from there. It was sort of like catching a disease. And it just won't let go of you.
Well, I grew up my father was headmaster of a boys' preparatory school. I grew up in a tremendously privileged life and full of all sorts of literary encouragement. And in the midst of that, at the age of 12 years old, I started keeping a little black notebook that where I wrote down a tasty language, that is words that I love to say, like azalea and jejune. Why a 12-year-old boy would like that word, I don't know. It means intellectually empty. Rhymes with moon and June. And then I also kept images in there that I didn't know why they obsessed me, but they did. Like a boy stirring a spider web with a stick. A little vandalism in the woods. The wake, let's say, of the feather that seems to fall just after sunset, that little dark tinge that happens. These are things I put down as images. The way that lightning bugs, when you put them in a jar, don't get on so well. They all light up, and then they turn bad. And then, so you shouldn't collect things. But that's what I was collecting, and maybe that's what was going wrong. This is my little collection of tasty language. But, so anyway, then I started writing short stories, and then in graduate school poems, and I always got encouragement, except for after I got my first book published, I went for 20 years sending book-length manuscripts out without getting any help, with any encouragement, nothing, everything got sent back. But that, I cannot be discouraged in this enterprise of writing for some reason. It's probably the grandiosity of growing up as the son of the headmaster of the school. You know, where when it was my birthday, I got to stand on the chair and 400 people sung happy birthday. So I'm just hopelessly encouraged.
Well, it will try, and I've never confessed this to anyone, privately or in public. This is the first time in public. My friends who are poets, what I'm about to say, I apologize. I started out as a poet, and this is going to shock all of you, I know. And the only reason I decided to become a poet was because I realized it impressed girls. But I didn't. I also learned that you could go to the library and find where the books of poems were. And you find the ones that had dust all over them, and you realize that nobody had opened them. Therefore, very few people would be likely to know what was in them. And I would just memorize poems out of the books. And then approach young ladies in the dining room and tell them that I had written a poem for them. And that I would be happy. I wish I had it with me, but maybe I remember it. Why don't we sit together and take a napkin and I'll write it down for you. And I would sit down and write things like, her hair was oh so dense a blur, of darkness midnight envied her, you know, those kind of things. And you always, they say, poets have this advantage, I think, so you always tell whether or not it meant anything to them. Don't look them in the eye. That was not right. Look at the neck. And if you saw the jugular vein pounding, you knew you had them. So that's how I got introduced to writing, and I certainly realized that I couldn't steal poems my entire life, so I became a journalist after that. And, I got into it through journalism, basically, and learned to love the language that I had loved from childhood as a reader. And I think that probably is true of every writer, is that reading experience is really the base for all of it. Good doctor.
Well, I'm like David Bottoms. I guess the seed was planted in my mind at Mercer University. And you people who weren't fortunate enough to go there, I'm sure have had to labor harder than David and I have. But Dr. Fred Jones was head of the English department there. And I was a pencil neck geek, age 15, who weighed 100 pounds when I went to Mercer. It's not important. And I managed to score high enough on English placement test that I got Dr. Jones, who, where he spit no grass grew. Very stern disciplinarian. You had to write 2 themes a week, and you had to do it. But if you made an A, you didn't have to take the second quarter of writing. Well, I worked real hard. I never found out exactly what a comma fault was, but I never made one, because he said if you make a comma fault, it's an automatic F. And he taught me to write correctly, and then I'd be blessed if he didn't wind up teaching you to write with perception and with one of his maxims was write about what you know. And for years I wrote prescriptions for antibiotics, high blood pressure. And unlike Terry, I learned poetry earliest from the bathroom walls in the public restroom in the Pitt County Courthouse. And you did not quote that to young ladies. Later, when I learned to memorize good poetry and quote it to ladies, I don't remember ever looking at their necks, Terry.
You were not advanced, I'm
You
sorry.
have some sort of face.
This is true.
But, so when I was 58, I began to have intimations of mortality and decided that I were going to write, and Dr. Jones had told me that he thought I could, that I better get cracking. So for 2 years, I worked on a book, and it was published, and to my great surprise, people besides my family members read it, and it received some acclaim, and it's a pretty heady experience then. It's hard work writing, it's lonely work, but as you say, there's a compulsion to it. Once you get started, you can't quit. You have to keep it up.
Well, I'd like to know when you started writing, maybe I could direct this question to Dr. Sams and the others can chime in, but when you started writing, were there particular models that you had in mind, other writers who sort of were standing behind you that you were aware of, that you felt you needed to emulate or live up to in some way?
No, I felt like I had to live up to Dr. Jones' expectations of me. And when I first started writing, it was very laborious, very awkward. I wrote 70 pages and said, this is terrible. And I tore it up and started all over. But I mean, gosh, I think you're influenced by everybody's work that you read in one way or the other, but as far as emulating any of it, I never tried.
I think it's a good question, and I really never thought about whether or not there was I had such an influence. I know, with me it depends on whether you're talking about journalism or whether you're talking about fiction, because both those experiences were so different. In journalism, I definitely had a model, and that was Furman Bisher. I learned how to, and I say this all the time, I learned how to write by copying Furman Bisher's columns every day when I was working for him, and I still, teachers disagree with me on this, I still think it's the best exercise in the world to learn how to write, is to copy somebody who's really good, until you learn something about their rhythms and their approaches, their use of language and everything else, and see if it suits you, if it helps you. And it helped me a great deal to do that. But in fiction, it was just, this is the character that I'm writing about, and this is the character, the nature of that character, and I've always just tried to be faithful to that, without thinking too much of whether there's I'm modeling it after anything.
You want to speak, Coleman?
You go ahead.
All right. I just had half a thought bouncing off what Terry just said. I actually remember when I was very young, this is going to sound crazy, but this is true, 12 or 14 years old, going to McClure's bookstore in Canton, Georgia, which was just about at the end of its life then, and it was run by my old second grade teacher. And finding on the shelf a copy of William Butler Yeats's collected poems, and believing that was a great treasure, and buying that book, or having my mother buy it for me, taking that book home, sitting on our pink couch in our living room by the side of Highway 5 in Canton, Georgia, and reading that poem after poem after poem, and not really understanding a thing about what I was reading, not understanding anything, but yet I still feel a great sense of consequence that I felt as I read those poems. I felt that something here meant something deep, that somebody was getting at something significant and consequential. And I think it was that drive that led me to serious literature and to writing. And when I approach my classes at Georgia State or elsewhere, I try to suggest to my students, my writing students, that language is a way of getting at what's significant in your life. Robert Penn Warren used to talk about being a yearner and yearning after consequence. He said that he had no theology, no specific theology, but he sensed a deeper meaning than we encounter in our everyday lives. And he often felt that he could just almost get to it. He called himself a yearner or a seeker. And I've always seen poetry and serious literature as a way of doing that, sort of there's a wonderful irony that as you're writing the poem's going out into the world. Ironically, at the same time, it's going inward. It's a form of self-exploration. And that's what I think compelled and propelled me early on to try to write and to emulate any number of people I really didn't understand.
When I went from Chattanooga to Chapel Hill, I began reading as I was going through, Asheville, right by Thomas Wolfe's house, Dixieland, that boarding house, and I began reading Thomas Wolfe and felt a kind of force, like an emotional head of steam, something coming through him that I wanted to do too. And I began writing in that grand mode of Thomas Wolfe, and wrote a short story. It got published in the Carolina Quarterly, and I thought I was Thomas Wolfe. And
With a better mother.
what?
With a better mother.
Better mother. Actually, a live brother, yeah. And so I began seeking out people, voices like that I wanted to assimilate, and found James Agee. We're speaking now evenings and afternoons on the porches of Knoxville, Tennessee, in the time that I lived there. So successfully disguised to myself as a child. That ain't bad. So that's the opening of Death in the Family. And so whatever you assimilate from being in the presence of writers that as their voices come through books, I took in those, and you can't neglect Shakespeare. Whenever I hear that language, something in me just says, God Almighty, I can do that. Yes, I can. That's my language too. And then I was in San Bernardino, California, and 1965, and went to hear Jim Dickey give a reading, and he just stood up on the podium there in the valley, and he just looked out and he said, Lord.
He said what?
Lord.
Was he sober?
I don't know.
I can guarantee you, no.
It was early in the afternoon. And so, yeah. So I just said, Southerners can be poets. This is and so I've taken a lot of early poems are very Dickey-esque in their treatment of imagery and rhythms of my own poems. And then you gradually, read other people, and
How did you fall in with Rumi?
that's a long story.
We got a lot of time.
No.
What
Well,
about
I
Sidney
did hear
Lanier?
something in that when I opened those books, those scholarly translations. I felt that I was entering some familiar region that was vast and at the same time familiar to me.
You sound like the marshes of Glen. Did you like that?
I did. Lie. And yeah, that's gorgeous. That poem was important.
Yeah.
Sophomore in high school. It was still a good poem.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's in this club too.
There he is.
Sidley. I like to call him Sidley. Sidney lived there.
Let me ask you, I mean, you're all talking about people who might have influenced you or at some point. Flannery O'Connor said in a much quoted statement in reference to William Faulkner that nobody wants his mule and wagon stalled on the same track the Dixie Limited is roaring down, by which she meant, I think, that his influence, he was such a powerful writer to her that her best way of dealing with him was not to think about him at all, but to try to steer clear, to stay off the track. And I just wondered whether there were writers that you've encountered, you might have already mentioned some of them, that you had to get by, you had to succeed in turning your backs on before you could really find your own voice.
Oh, yeah. James Dickey.
Dickey's one of them.
You and I were talking earlier, I was telling about Dickey's influence on my own work, early work, and that it was really non-existent because when I first started writing poetry, I was too stupid to know what a great poet James Dickey was. And I sort of dismissed him, and it's very good that I did because I didn't have to live under the burden of that great shadow. I've heard people who were slightly older. Dickey's a full generation older than I am, and I've heard people who were between Dickey and me tell me that they felt that their writing career was just almost thwarted by Dickey's style. I remember a professor telling me that early in his career he had tried to change his style from his natural way of speaking because it resembled Dickey's so much, and he never developed after that. I didn't have that problem with Dickey because I just didn't know enough at the time. I didn't know his work, and so I was blessed with getting one or two books under my belt before I actually had to encounter the weight of his writing. So that's the way I avoided it, ignorance.
Any other forbidden writers in your background?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've read everything just about, and some of it I wish I hadn't. But, I mean, we all read Shakespeare, we all read Tennyson, we all read Milton. And then as you branch out, and you go up to college and you're not under a prescribed pattern of what you have to read. And you discover Thomas Wolfe, and you discover T.S. Eliot, and Lord have mercy, you discover Edna St. Vincent Millay, and which will do you a lot more good than looking at a neck.
Speak
But,
for yourself. I like the next.
But yeah, I mean, I grew up reading, and I grew up with a really extremely good education. Looking back on it, I went to 11th grade high school. My high school graduating class was 38, but we had teachers who were absolutely dedicated to teaching, and they stimulated you to read good books. But we had to read a different Shakespeare play every 4 years in English class of my high school career in Fayette County. Started off with Merchant of Venice and wound up with Hamlet. And
When I hear this, I'm really envious of that experience in the background. I honestly believe by the time I got to high school, I had read more books than any teacher we had in high school.
Where'd you go to high school, Terry?
But, well, Royston, which is, I mean, it's a Class C school.
Yeah.
My God, they
Sounds
didn't,
like it.
they didn't, well, we were poor.
Well,
You know, what
we
can I
were
tell
class
you?
double A.
Yeah, all right, double A, God. The point being, I really do envy the fact that you had that instruction. We didn't have anything like that instruction. Nothing. Shakespeare was never mentioned. Never. In all my years in high school.
Did they
I didn't
teach
get-
Latin?
Oh, Lord, no, they didn't teach English.
First things first.
We had absolutely no languages. We had no chemistry. We didn't have anything.
You mean
We didn't
you
have a band, for crying out loud.
You mean you didn't even study French?
We didn't study French, no. We did not, but you're right. Cobb was a very erudite man compared to our staff over there, I can assure you. But I think, thinking about this, my real influence is not so much out of literature as it is out of theater. And especially when it comes to language and dialogue, etc. The greatest influence I had was studying theater in college. And when you're going from Tennessee Williams to Ionesco to Shakespeare to
O'Neill.
William O'Neill, all of them, you learn to listen for a different voice and a different way of expression and different cadences and everything else. And when I'm working in fiction now, I'm a lot more influenced by that than I am by say,
But what
reading a
better
novel.
theater can you find than in Huckleberry Finn?
Oh, that's true. That's true. Except, we didn't do Huckleberry Finn on stage, but yeah, I don't disagree with that.
But I mean, it doesn't have to be a playwright.
No, but it was with me. I'm saying you're right, but that's what it was with me, was the play.
Well, here's a question. Maybe it's not a fun one to answer, but all of you grew up in the South, and all of you in your work reflect elements of a traditional South. And yet we all now live in a South that's very much changing, and
Yeah.
the landscape is altering. And I think we often hear that one of the big forces that motivates writers of the American South is change, and how it makes people worry about the loss of the past and the uncertainty of the future. I just wonder how this constantly transforming South that we live in somehow or the other finds its way into what you write.
I don't think there's any question about it. The nostalgia of it. You listen to your parents, you listen to your grandparents on the front porch before you go to bed at night in the summertime, before air conditioning. And you absorb all of these old stories about how things were and how things are, and projections about how things are going to be. And then you wake up 80 years later and you say, ain't anybody ever envisioned this? And I don't know what has done more to transform the old South than air conditioning and power lawnmowers. But it's changed it completely. I guarantee you this group wouldn't be sitting in here 50 years ago without air conditioning. I mean, they'd be fanning like nobody's business. And we take all of these creature comforts for granted. It's civilization, it's progress. We paid for it in pretty dear coin in some respects. And I love the past, but I love the present. And I am still growing up in the South. My wife thinks she's going to get me raised, but it's an ongoing process. Yes, you're exactly right.
David?
Well, I don't know what to say about that, really. I think there are several different Souths. My South is probably not Coleman's South, which is not Terry's South, or Dr. Sanders' South. I always felt a real affinity for Southern culture. We talked earlier about what it means to be a Southern writer, and whether I felt that was any obstacle. I don't feel that way. I think the South has a great tradition of literature, both fiction and poetry. If a writer doesn't really work outside of culture, I think, I don't know who said this, either you find your place in the culture or you rebel against it in some way, but you don't work in a vacuum. So the South, God bless, I mean, it's just rich in blessings. And I mean, you can have rats at a dump. Where are you going to find that in Cambridge? So the South has been a blessing in a great many ways for me, and a curse in others. But it's where I am, where I was born, and who I am, and I just make the best of it I can.
And a jolly good job you do of it, boy.
Well, bless you.
I love the old Southern storytelling tradition. I grew up in the middle of some wonderful Middle Tennessee storytellers, the best there were. And they told stories like they were dancing, grand gestures and move around. Just a great theatrical kind of storytelling. Jim Hitt couldn't sit down when he's telling a story. He's all over the place. And so I love that. But I'd like to say something about that surely now we are, and even those Middle Tennessee people were influenced by, say, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Turgenev, the French writers. They absorbed world culture, and surely now we can say we are more than Southern. I mean, it's okay to absorb all that, but we are also world citizens, aren't we?
That's right.
We've got to be more than Southerners. I adore the South, but I'm also not an American, not in some ways not a Southerner. I am all those things, and a Muslim, and and a Buddhist, and I'm from China. Hell yeah, I love Li Po, Tu Fu, I mean, we are all these. We are planetary people now, aren't we? And surely we're planetary artists. Although, I don't know. I just wanted to say that.
Coleman,
Yeah.
I grew up on the side of Highway 5, and my grandpa had a little country store, L.N. Bottom's Grocery, sat there for 52 years.
Wow.
Sold everything from every kind of dry goods to canned goods, stuff like that. Bologna was like the big stuff there. You go in the front door, this oil floor, one little light bulb on a cord, big potbelly stove. I was raised in that store. I never heard one story in that store.
Really?
Not
They
one
didn't have a
story.
stove in the back with
They had a stove, big potbelly stove. People would go and spit tobacco on it. I never heard one story come out of that
Did
store.
they play checkers?
No checkers.
No checkers.
So that's they're cliches about the South that don't always ring true.
Uh-huh.
I remember Charles Wright telling me that
David,
he grew
you
up
might
in
have heard at least one story.
I don't recall any stories.
You weren't listening.
Not in
That
that
may be
grocery.
it.
That was all
maybe.
business. wasn't it?
Stealing
That's all
Coke.
Dime Coca-Colas.
But
Yeah,
I think that's interesting because I don't remember stories being told in those environments. I remember the stories being told in my family. I mean, I'm the 11th of 12 children. All I had to do is listen to my older siblings.
Yeah.
And I got all those stories. I honestly, if I think about it, how many times I've referenced something that they've said that overheard. And it becomes, it's a fragment, it becomes a character, it becomes a scene, it becomes whatever it does. But I think it's a practical reason to enjoy being from the South as a writer, being a Southerner. I'm asked a lot when I go out. If people want to know what's the title of your remarks, and I've for years had only one title. Doesn't matter who I'm talking to or what the subject is. I have one title, and that title is Southern Literature is Alive and Well and Resides in New York City. Because I think that's where it does reside for the most part. That every few years you will see somebody there, the Times, the New Yorker, some publication will declare a renaissance in Southern literature. Have you ever seen them declare a renaissance in any other region? Not once have I seen it, but they do it in the South. And I think there's something nice about that. I know I have friends, writer friends, that when they go to New York, they play the Southern role to the hilt. I know one guy that wears a white suit and a string tie every time he goes up to speak to his publisher. He does it. Wouldn't wear it down here for anything in the world, but he looks like Colonel Sanders up there. And I've learned when dealing with New York editors, when you've got something, you're describing a double tree or a single tree or some farm implement or whatever, and they want to cut it out. And if you're irritated enough by it, there's a surefire way of keeping it in the story. You just write in the margin, but this is Southern, and they won't touch it.
When I first wrote my first book, and I had a book, and I didn't know what to do with it, and I went to Jim Bunn, and I said, Jim, I've written a book. I want you to see what you think about it. He's a good friend of mine. We were raised together. He said that he had a real sinking feeling when I handed him that because he knew it was going to be terrible, and he knew he was close enough friend he was going to have to be honest with me. Instead of that, he brought it back, the manuscript. 3 nights later, rang my doorbell and said, "You got a real son of a bitch here." And I've never had any words of praise that rang any truer. So then we started talking. He said, "What are you going to do with it?" Well, I won't go into all that story because he convinced me that I should publish it. But we went into the business of who you going to get to publish it. And I said, "I don't know. Where do you send it to get it published?" And so he got Jim Townsend, who was the first editor of Atlanta Magazine, who smoked marijuana.
But he drank a lot before he smoked marijuana too.
Well, he didn't quit drinking when he started smoking. He would blow smoke rings with it. And but he asked me if he could read it. He said he's the best editor I've worked with. And I said, yeah. I mean, as far as I was concerned, anybody could have read it. I was thrilled anybody wanted to read it. And so he arranged a meeting between me and him and Jim Townsend at Heron's restaurant. When Townsend comes in, and I didn't know what sort of character he was, he bragged on everybody. Dear heart, this is the most wonderful thing. He told everybody. Ask Conroy about it. But he just pumped me up. My head was this big around, and Jim said, well, I tell you, I have ghostwritten or I have edited for every major publishing house in New York, and said, we'll get this book published, and it'll be published. Jim said, who are you going to send it to? You're going to send it? He started, so I couldn't pronounce some of those names. Houghton Mifflin. It never occurred to me that I would ever be called on to pronounce that word. And yeah, that's true. And then Townsend called me and recommended Helen Elliott, who had just started Peachtree Publishing, and said that she wanted to meet with me. So we all met down at Heron's again. And I thought, well, a lady publisher is going to have long skirts and short hair and sensible shoes. And Helen Elliott comes in looking like somebody that's president of the Baptist Missionary Society in a big church, and softly dressed and softly spoken. And we sat down to eat, and Miller and Townsend were eating, and Townsend had started smoking. She said, well, Sambo, I love this book, and I brought a contract along, and she opened a little white patent leather purse and pulled out these papers and handed it to me. And I looked over at Townsend and Minna, and I said, well, do I send this before y'all send it to New York? Do I sign this before you send it to New York or not? And I couldn't get eye contact with those two men. Minna had discovered a treasure map in the bottom of his plate. He was scraping around with his fork, and Townsend was blowing big smoke rings up to the ceiling, and Elliot grabbed up the book, the contract, and said, well, I didn't know that was considered, and I'm sure it will be published. Any publisher will be happy to have it. And she put that contract in her little purse and got up and marched out. And we were walking back up to Minna's office at the paper. He had his hands in both pockets, and my children had told me, don't ever put your hands in your pockets in Atlanta, they'll murder you. But I said, Jim, I said, I think I really offended that lady. And Minna said, yeah, she was pissed. And so I thought about it about 3 days, and I called her. And I said, are you still interested in publishing my book? And she said, yes, I am. What made you decide? And I said, just exactly what you were talking about. I said, I can't stand the idea of a Yankee getting a hold of it. I said, it wouldn't be the same book. And that was the beginning of a long and extremely beautiful relationship. And she published that book. We talked on the telephone at least once a day for 6 months. And it was coming down to blue line time. That's before we had computers. And she said, Sambo, it's time now. You can't make any big changes in the book. And I said, I'll tell you what, let's do, Helen. One change. I said, can you go through that book and lowercase Yankee? And she said, let's.
I'm wondering whether any of
I may be a
the,
world citizen, but by cracker, I'm a Southerner first.
I wonder whether any of the members of the panel want to ask questions of other members of the panel.
When we get together to have coffee, we talk about this.
Late afternoon.
Late afternoon.
Right. That'd be good.
That's a good question, Hugh. It's more uncomfortable to talk to one another in front of an audience than it is to sit around a table and talk to one another, I suppose. But I asked David a question, and he answered it in an unsatisfactory way to me. So I'll ask him again. David, why aren't you writing prose now, as well as poetry?
He wrote a novel.
I know that, but now I'm talking about.
Oh.
It's been years since.
Terry, I answered that. I was perfectly truthful with you.
I know you were, but I want these people to
I
hear it.
told you that I didn't have any talent for that.
This is not true. This is not true.
And I wrote a couple of novels years ago. One of them was a good novel, and one of them did write well, but it was a major disappointment with movies and all that sort of stuff, and I became disheartened with the whole business of it. And also I discovered that I was a lot lazier than most fiction writers need to be. Writing fiction is very arduous. You really have to be dedicated. You have to stick to it. It's that 9 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon sort of thing. Poetry for me was much more a thing of the moment, for lack of a better word. It was much more of an inspiration, an idea, and you flesh that out in however long it takes you, and then perhaps you work on it for a very long time. But I didn't enjoy fiction writing that much. It was more of a job to me, and eventually as time moved on and I tried to write more fiction that didn't work, I decided if I had any talent, it probably was with poetry and not fiction.
The reason I asked the question is, and you might not have even heard this talk, David, I don't know, but during that period of time, there were lot of discussion in Atlanta among the writers out there, a little debate on whether or not you were going to focus more of your time in fiction than you would in poetry. Yeah, I mean, it was just that, you were on the fence with a lot of us, saying, where is he gonna go with this? And then when you didn't come back with more fiction, and the question was, well, he made the
Where do you
decision,
get that
but I
us
liked
business?
it.
Where you get that us business? I never was consulting like that.
Well, this was before you were writing fiction, I think, wasn't it?
No, that's what.
Jerry, maybe if more of those guys had
Did you
bought my
take-
novels,
Well,
I'd
I don't know, we were just
Do
some writers.
you carry an index card like our friend John Stone, to write down a particular sentence
No, I'm not
catches your
that
fancy?
dedicated. No, Coleman, didn't you used to carry a notebook around with you?
I didn't got it today, but
Yeah.
it's just a mistake. I usually carry a notebook around everywhere.
I was never any good at that. I always, if a notion came to me for a poem, and usually the best case scenario would be when what I call the figurative device of a poem, or the metaphorical device of the poem, would just occur to me. And that would usually wind up in my early poems as the last line of the poem. I would just stop whatever I was doing. If I was trying to go to sleep at night, it was 1:30 in the morning, I'd get up and I'd go write it down and work on it and flesh it out. But occasionally I've found myself grabbing a napkin or something like that. But I was never really responsible enough to carry a notebook. And I know many people who do that.
Before the thought leaves me, I want to tell you why you never heard a story in your daddy's.
All right?
You were too noisy.
That's
When
what they
you
say,
came
yeah.
in, I guarantee you, those old men chewing tobacco and spitting it on that hot stove, when they said, "Oh, watch your language, this is a kid coming in,"
That
and
probably
they hushed.
some
And
of
as
it.
soon as they left, he said, "Oh, I don't believe he's the one knocked her up."
I'd like
You
to
probably got that.
invite members of the audience to ask questions. Ask them of everybody or any individual up here. Just raise your hand, yes.
Shakespeare has a line that's delivered for Luke's student philosopher. My tongue can never learn sweet smoothing words, or maybe the sweet soothing words. Anyway, with regard to writing, especially poetry, there is perhaps the idea that it is writing of nice, sweet things, using nice, sweet language. But what I would like to ask is, in order to escape this idea of moonlight and roses as opposed to the heat of the burning sun and ragweed, in your writing, did you consciously or purposely attempt to infuse it or put in some of the, what might be termed the grim and the gritty? For example, years ago when my mother read Mr. Carey's After Eli, she commented, "He may be a good writer, but it's a horrible story." So to escape this idea of being particularly nice and pleasant, overly nice or overly pleasant, did you give thought to putting in things into your writing that were perhaps not quite nice or not quite pleasant?
Thank you.
Yeah, I have. And I don't write poetry. I think poetry is the aristocracy of literature. But I can't write poetry. I can read poetry, I can memorize poetry, and I can admire and love poetry, but I can't write it. But I have purposely written some things. And one of them, I'll tell you, I think it's probably the strongest story I ever wrote. And it's certainly the worst one. But it came out of an experience that I had in my practice. And I felt that this was a story that needed to be told. And I didn't know how to craft it. I crafted it around one of Browning's poems called Cyria's Lover. And I have been castigated and condemned and thrown out. That's the only story I've ever had that I got hate mail about. But it was a bad story. But it was a true story.
About a man who kills his lover?
Yeah. Right. And it grew out of my first experience with treating an AIDS patient. And I was flabbergasted at this subculture that was going on. And people tell their doctors things that they don't tell their preachers or their wives, and which is a good thing. And and I felt like that this story needed to be told.
You really think it was your worst story?
I think it was probably the most terrible thing I've written. But I think it was the strongest thing I've written.
Because that means the best.
That,
Did it get published?
Yeah,
Where is it?
it's the last story in The Widow's Night.
that was a very good question. I just have one thing I want to say about it. And I can't get this quote right. I used this line as an epigraph for my second book, I think. Robert Penn Warren has this wonderful line. This is kind of a paraphrase. He said, "Beauty is another word for what we call reality." And I think that says just about everything that poets are after in terms of weighing those two things. Beauty is another word for what we call reality.
It interests me what your mom said about my book. Let me explain, and I appreciate that comment a lot because I don't disagree with her, to be honest with you. Let me tell you why I wrote the book. I wrote it because I got into an argument with James Dickey over deliverance. In my view of deliverance, and I love the book, Dickey was, to me, a remarkable writer. But we had an argument about the way the mountain people were treated. He did not grow up among them. I did. And I disagreed with the sodomy, references that he had. And we were talking about it. I thought he treated them like mutants and said so. We had a wonderful conversation about this particular scene, and he finally told me, well, this was done for dramatic purposes, a dramatic device, and I thought it was shameful that anybody would do that until I started writing fiction, and then I realized, no, that's not shameful. That's, if you can do it and get by with it, do it and get by with it. But in that particular thing, I wanted to say that the mountain people that I knew were survivors.
Yes.
And the only reason I wrote it that way, and by the way, it was inspired by a classic piece of theater out of Italy, set 18th century Italy, by a playwright called Ugo Betti. Almost to the degree that I've been accused of plagiarism in that. I guess that would be
Not by many people.
not by many people, because not many people know that particular playwright. But it wasn't. I mean, I had seen the play and I reviewed it as a reviewer many years before I started to write that book. And of course, there were certain things that stuck that I didn't know were sticking in my mind. But I wrote the story, and it was a horrible story in terms of harshness. I wrote it because it was a reality. Yes. And these people did survive. Yes. And I made them women because of my 7 older sisters. That's where I learned about the survival of women. So that one was a very personal,
Which book
experience. After Eli, second book. It was interesting.
I thought Dark 30 was worse.
Dark 30 is a lot worse than After Eli, in terms of horror.
When I think about that nail, I think
Other questions? Yes.
What was the question?
What can I do to become a better writer? Teachers, I mean, students may ask that question. Write.
Right, and if it's not any good, tear it up and start over.
Right. Read a lot, right? There's a million different approaches to this, I suppose, but you cannot avoid those two things, I don't think.
When I was at Mercer, we had a little literary clique down there, and there was a fellow who was the local guru, the poet guru, very talented man actually, that later became a painter. We became good friends, but I came up to him one day in the co-op, Dr. Sams, and I said, he was the poet, the big poet in the community, and I said, Oliver, what are you reading? And he said to me, I'm not reading any, I don't have time to read, I'm a writer. And consequently, I never read anything of his in print. But Terry is exactly right. I think in order to be a writer, you have to be really an avid reader. We were talking about this earlier on. You asked me what poets I read, contemporary poets, and I was embarrassed because I hadn't been reading very many lately. I've been caught in the 19th century. I've been caught in Dostoevsky. I read the entire major novel, everything I think Dostoevsky had published, and then Tolstoy. And there's some wonderful new translations of Tolstoy just out, and Dostoevsky. But I try to get my grad students to read novels. You can't beat the Russians, and that's just my biggest advice. Read, and don't be afraid of reading the big books, the big novels. Moby Dick in American literature, my favorite, and then The War and Peace, and the Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment.
Read the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
It's a marvelously written book. It ought to be. It's been edited more than anything else. But the way they develop characters with very succinct language, but you actually have visual images of these people and the stories that they tell in Genesis. Don't read it as a Baptist. Read it as a reader. And when I quit reading it as a Baptist, I was really horrified but fascinated.
There's a danger as a young writer that you pretend to be a writer. You know, and you take on the clothes of the writer, and you get the writer part. You get something in the top floor or something. You have to walk up. Yeah. And so, yeah, you have to watch out about being just pretending to seduce women. I mean,
I had more fun doing that than I had
right.
writing.
There's some reason we do not know why women are impressed by rhyme, particularly if you can include their name.
Yeah, that's a good
There's
trick.
some of them not impressed. Anyway, yeah.
I never understood why they responded to E.E. Cummings.
Hey.
Quote E.E. Cummings is tough. You like E.E. Cummings?
I couldn't stand E.E. Cummings until John Stone got a hold of it. And he wrote a poem, and I can't quote all of it, but it's between a man and a woman, and it's in Cummings style with no punctuation and everything. But can I feel, said he, and she said, how much, said he, a lot, said he. How much is too much? She said, where you are, said she, and it goes on down, and it's absolutely a marvelous poem. But all this business of 3 words in a line and no punctuation mark and then 5, I never could get with Cummings.
Me either. I couldn't get with it either.
I love it.
We're approaching the end of our time, but I wanted to ask the writers again on the subject of change. How do you feel about the prospect of what you write being read by readers in some form other than the form of a printed book? For instance, on a website or on an electronic device. Does the growth of these kinds of ways of reading mean the death of the book or the death of literature? How do you feel about that?
You're talking to a dinosaur here. I don't even have a computer. No, I can't type.
I think that.
I can barely write. But I have a niece who can read my writing now,
And types up.
sir, and then she types.
He has to have his stuff translated by a pharmacist.
Well, everybody's got to make a living.
I know. I think that the Kindle is going to change the way books are presented or literature is presented in this world. And the Kindle, I mean the Sony device and the Kindle or whatever device they come up with. I believe within 15 or 20 years, the young people of that period will be far more accustomed to holding a Kindle than they will be to holding a book. A Kindle is a book in a digital thing where you're going to put 250 novels on a chip in there. And it is becoming incredibly popular. If you want to have a safe investment, put some money in it, because I really believe it's going to.
I sense some reaction from this side of the stage.
Well, Coleman is a book person, but I'm hearing him go yay for Kindle or something. I don't, but it's kind of odd because I don't think young people read books now. I think we're entering a second dark ages, at least in my classes. I'm doing what I can in a very small way, but there's so many things online you can go to, as George Bush says, the Google, and Google one of your poems, and I can go Google one of my poems, and I can find where it's been blogged. People have put it on blogs, 7 or 8 times, and people are reading these things on blogs and things like Poetry Daily, and I go to Amazon.com to see how my books are selling. They're like, 999,000, nobody's buying any books because poems are floating all over, cyberspace.
It's going to really change
Yeah.
all of that. I love this. Last year, or year before last year I think, in Japan, half the novels published in Japan were written by thumbs. They were written on Blackberries and telephone. Half of them.
In Japanese?
I hope so. But that amazes me because that's the communication that these kids have. They're doing a lot of it. Did they do that in the class, David?
I don't have the slightest idea. It's just frightening to me. I love books. I like the feel of the book. I like to hold the book in my hand. I like to sit at night, very late at night, with a lamp coming down at exactly the right angle, the rest of the room dark. Maybe little nocturnes on the stereo, very, very low. I like to read books that way. And so I'm frightened of technology.
But
It's here.
about poetry, every book of poetry, the new book of poetry that comes out now has a CD in the back with the poet himself or herself reading the poetry. This is a very good thing. To hear Galway Connell reading his poems, by God, you get the poem a lot better than if you're just reading it off a page. If we could, this is a wonderful thing. And so I adore that part of technology about poetry that's happening. Even anthologies will have a group of the poems selection being spoken out loud by the poet.
I still don't think that's a substitute for the poem written on the page that you can experience in a private moment, just quietly, just yourself. Maybe it's an aid. I don't think it's a substitution.
David, I agree with you, except I think that the kids are not going to know that it's not a substitution.
Because they can't read.
Well, they're reading something because they're writing a whole lot.
Yeah.
What I like to do is get Stephen Mitchell's translations of Rilke's Dueno elegies, and then get Stephen Mitchell reading them, and look at the text and hear him read them, and then I write notes.
Does he explain them to you?
No, he doesn't explain.
Because I could use that.
Yeah, right. But anyway, that's a very rich experience, you know, I sit there and,
Yeah.
and light a candle, it's like a,
I think, you know, some people are dynamite readers. Coleman is a wonderful reader. I don't think there's a better reader in America than Coleman Barks. I've heard him, I'm telling you the truth. I've heard him read a number of times in person, and I've got his CDs, and I listen to them and go along in the books too. But it's a phenomenal experience. Quite frankly, everyone doesn't read as well as you do, Coleman. You know, some people kind of, you know, read flat, but there has been a big movement toward that now, you know, and it's probably a good thing.
Do poets write sonnets anymore?
Not very good ones, many of them, I don't think. You know, that comes, I caution against that in my classes, my undergrad classes. Coleman can tell you about this also. There was a whole new movement, sort of formalist movement a few years ago, where people were writing in forms, but sonnets are terrifically hard in other forms. And I tell my people, look, the sonnet is an Italian form. Every fourth word in Italian rhymes. This is American English. Nothing rhymes. You're going to get yourself in trouble. I tried to write sonnets 30 years ago, and I would wind up writing a sonnet about how I love peanut butter. By the time I get to the 14th line, I hate peanut butter because none of the love words rhymed. And it's really difficult, at least for me. I don't have that kind of talent. But some people are still attempting to write in forms and doing it very, very nicely. I'm not one of them.
I'm going to have
Shakespeare
to,
wrote sonnets.
And beautifully, yeah, I'm not Shakespeare.
And
I'm going to have to call the formal part of this panel to a close. I thank our panelists for a nice conversation.
I do have just a couple of things to close whatever.
Pardon? Okay, so go ahead.
Okay. If you don't mind me borrowing your microphone for a second. Well, I'm Toby Graham with the University Libraries, and on behalf of the Harvard Rare Book and Manuscript Library and the University Libraries, we do appreciate all of you being here. We extend our thanks to our esteemed panel and to Dr. Hugh Rupersberg for moderating today. I want to remind you all that the induction ceremony is tomorrow morning at 10:30, and we hope you'll be with us for that as well, and that will be on the fourth floor of this building in the rotunda. Immediately following this session, there will be a book signing when you can interact with our panelists and get your book signed. So I hope you'll stay with us for that. And I also need to acknowledge a sponsor of today's event, the Reynolds Plantation. So let's just close with a round of applause for our panelists and our moderator, and thank you so much.
Thank you.